an awful sentence. And I think the measure of how awful that sentence of transportation in itself was can be found in the behavior of a whole range of other women who were pardoned at the same time. There are some 5 or 6 or 7 women who get up before the court and say, no, hang me tomorrow, please, rather than send me to Australia. Being transported to Australia in the 1780s would be the equivalent of being sent to the moon.
It had taken 5 months to fill the Lady Juliana with her cargo of women. Finally, on July 29, 1789, the ship left the shores of England and headed south. The crew did not consider the women a threat, so once at sea, they were hauled up from the orlop and allowed out on deck. Leaving the fetid air of London far behind them must have been a welcome liberation.
I think that it must have been fantastic. For women who'd been in jail for several years, it must have been wonderful for them. You've got fresh air, you don't have to do any work in order to get your food. There's food, drink and clothes supplied by the government. There's nobody beating you up, you don't have to turn tricks. You don't have to go out at night and wonder where your next plate of meat is going to come from. You are, to some extent, looked after.
The ships that followed the Lady Juliana to Australia in the ensuing months were run by slave traders. Prisoners were kept shackled in heavy chains below deck with very little food. But this ship had a precious cargo whose survival was essential.
The women are so valuable to the British government that they're willing to sign the contract that guarantees good food, that they're going to be well fed at ports. There's money put aside to have a surgeon on the ship so that there's medical attendance throughout the voyage. And that's in a tremendously costly contract. They never sign another contract like that again.
The Lady Juliana would crisscross the oceans, skirting the coast of Africa, head west to South America, then back east around the Cape and on to Australia. The voyage would take the best part of a year. With so long at sea, the 35 sailors were allowed to take full advantage of the 225 female prisoners in their care.
When we were fairly out at sea, every man on board took a wife from among the convicts.
The girl with whom I lived, Sarah, for I was as bad in this point as all the others. She was a girl of a modest, reserved turn, as kind and true a creature as ever lived. I had fixed my fancy upon her from the moment I had knocked the rivet out of her irons upon my anvil.
John Nichol may have treated his so-called wife well, but to Delia, it seems the women were powerless to refuse.
The men were the seamen, they were in charge of everything, they gave out the food, they ensured that the cleaning, or, you know, the organisation of the ship, it was all in the control of men.
Delia's ancestor, Anne Marsh, was the next to be selected as a wife. She was taken by the ship's surgeon, Richard Alley. Whether the women went willingly or not, there were distinct advantages to being a sailor's mate.
They'd get better food, they'd get better treatment, they'd have a nicer time on the voyage. And maybe some of them fancied these men. You know, we're talking about women who, most of them are between 18 and 25. The men are of a similar age. They're there for 12 months together, some of them more than 12 months. I think it would be very surprising if relationships didn't grow up between them.
Better relations between the convicts and the crew bought the women the run of the ship, as well as a new commercial role. The ship's agent had them sewing shirts to sell in the colony. But one woman would teach Rachel Hoddy Rachel Turner and the others how to run a business of their own. Her name was Mrs. Elizabeth Barnsley. Mrs. Barnsley had been a leading light of the London crime scene. Decked out in the finest of dresses and brandishing 10-pound notes, the enterprising shoplifter had conned her way into the very best of London's designer stores. Sadly for her, she got caught.
The thing that one has to keep in mind with Barnsley is the value of the goods she's actually stealing. It's the equivalent of walking into a jeweler and palming a Rolex. She really is out to make a good living out of this.
8 weeks into the voyage, the ship arrived at its first port of call, the Spanish island of Tenerife. There, Mrs. Barnsley showed her fellow inmates that just because they were holed up on a British convict ship didn't mean they couldn't turn a profit.
The first place we stopped at was Santa Cruz, on the island of Tenerife. We did not restrain the people on shore from coming on board through the day. The captains and seamen who were in port at the time paid us many visits.
A ship laden with over 200 women caused a tremendous stir. It seems that with Mrs. Barnsley acting as the mistress of operations, the Lady Juliana became a floating brothel.